Hey guys, we're here on day 24. So if you take out the notes we started from yesterday, day 23, we're going to start you down. Sorry, we're going to start you down here. So you're about halfway down the second page. Okay, on the back side there, we are on the wage gap. Okay, so we're going to talk about some things, some trends in the United States economy today about how much money people make on average. Some pretty interesting stuff. But first, obviously, we have a daily blog here, your first one for today. What I want you to do is I want you to rank what role each of these play in how much money somebody earns. Okay, so again, you've got about six, different things. So you've got your talent, personal motivation, education, race, gender, and then like your starting point, which represents like how much money your parents have, okay, and kind of where you start out at. And we're going to look at some stats here. So take a second, go ahead and rank those things and explain your thoughts. Hopefully, you came up with some things. Obviously, in a perfect world, um, which doesn't exist, right? We would want to say that talent and motivation and maybe education would be the three main things that influence how much we earn. But we know that that's not necessarily the case, right? We live in a far from perfect world, and we're going to see some stats here that show us some differences in how much money people earn. Okay, and so here in the United States, all right, um, we know that coming from a successful family is probably a benefit, okay, or an advantage. I wouldn't call it necessarily the be all end all, but it definitely helps, okay. And on the flip side, coming from a poor family is probably does the opposite, right? It makes things a little bit more difficult for us. Well, this statistic here, this graph shows us a couple different things. So what this research did was they took a study group and they broke their incomes into five equal portions. Okay, so this is the top 20% of rich Americans versus the bottom 20%. And then just using the top as an example here, this is where I was born, and then this is where I ended up. Okay, so they took where you were born. So if your parents were rich, you started here. If your parents were extremely poor, you started down here, right? And then everything in between. And if I was very rich, I would end up, there was about a 40% chance that I would stay in the very rich. There was a 8% chance that I would end up in the very bottom, the poorest group. Whereas on the other side of things, if I started out in the poorest as a poorest American, then I would stay there in the likelihood of about 40% also, maybe 42%. Only about a 5 or 6% chance that I would end up in the top. So, especially at the ends of being poor or rich, like they use the term sticky, like I'm likely to stay there. If I'm in the middle, right? If I'm in the middle 60% here, things are kind of almost like a coin flip, right? And so again, there's probably a little bit of an advantage over here with this second richest group, but for the most part, it's kind of a coin flip. And so that's just one thing that one study that has kind of come about. Now, the next thing that this study did was that they took the bottom group, so these people here, in the top group, these people here, and they said, okay, if you don't go to college, okay, or go to college, where do you end up? All right, and so what they found was that first of all, the poorest Americans, 89% of the poorest Americans did not go to college. If they don't go to college, again, the likelihood of where they end up is listed here, right? If they do go to college, that's kind of the equalizer. But again, only 11% of people from that group went to college. On the flip side, 53% of people from the richest group went to college. Obviously, that really tips the scales in their favor if they do that, right? And 47% did not go, which again, from there, kind of evens things out. Okay, so um, anyway, those are just some stats. If you want to kind of know where you would fall into that, which you'd have to know your family's income, but you could almost kind of guess. So they're called quintiles. Okay, so if your family makes more than $202,000 a year, you would be in that top 20%, meaning that you would be in this group. As you kind of go down, just out of your curiosity, again, we talked yesterday about how much money you need to make to be comfortable and those types of things. Um, you can kind of see where people fall into based on household income. Okay, which would be if it's a married couple, that would be their incomes added together. Okay, and they throw the top 5% in there too. So I mean, you can just kind of see how much money people make on average based on throughout the United States and looking at that. There is actually a term for what this difference in income is we are experiencing. Okay, there's a wage gap between men and women, and also minorities and whites. And we're going to look at some stats here. Okay, so historically, you can see that on average, men make about, just do the quick math, just do the looking at it, they're about $10,000 more a year than women. And again, this is from 2016. We got some more recent stats here, but this was the picture that I was able to find. And then we also see that whites make significantly more than minorities. We're going to look at some of those stats, maybe explain some of that stuff as we go through. So here's kind of the chart here of how much women make versus men, and I kind of it was kind of surprising to me, because if I sit there and think like, okay, which types of jobs will women make as much as men? I would say like, okay, like being a lawyer, where it's all brain power and things like that, and um, things where like physical strength is not a factor. And I would say, well, construction would be where women might not make nearly as much, because it could be physical, and maybe not every woman can do every physical thing that every man can do. Okay, just kind of trying to say, what would it be? Well, it would turn out that I would be completely wrong, as you can see, that women are actually the fairest paid in those types of construction jobs, whereas the legal jobs, like being a lawyer down here at the bottom, is actually the biggest uh, disparity, where women make only just about a little more than half of what men make in that particular field. So I kind of was thinking about it a little bit, like, okay, so who's the discriminator of paying women such less amount of money? And I think the discrimination doesn't come from employers. That'd be really, really hard to do, because if I'm an employer, it's easy for me to be able to be identified and say, oh, you pay men more than women. That's against the law. There's discrimination laws. And so I actually think it comes from people like you and I that buy these services, right? So like if I'm going to have to hire a lawyer, okay, I would not be I would be hard to be convinced to say that some men would be like, I am never going to hire a woman lawyer, right? And so that discrimination that can take place, not necessarily, like I said, from employers, but from people like you and I that are just commonly buying these services, right? And so that discrimination is kind of a tricky thing, but I think that obviously it does exist in those types of situations. Whereas in construction, right, like the employer, I'm hired to do construction, I can't discriminate, because word will get out that I'm discriminating, and I could get sued by the people I'm discriminating against. Now, in terms of races, okay, here's the stats that you want to kind of focus on the most. So here's your whites, and I just got everybody kind of grouped together here. So here's your whites per week, okay, blacks, African Americans per week, Asians per week, and then Hispanics down at the bottom per week. So you can see that whites make significantly more than the minorities in the United States, minus the Asians, right? And just a couple ways to explain some of these things is we're going to see here in a second that education is one of the equalizers, right? We've kind of mentioned that, and probably access to that education. And remember that those of you familiar with the history of the United States, it's not until like 1963 that African Americans get the Brown versus Board of Education, right? We desegregate schools, and so the access to the same educational avenues that whites had, is difficult, right? And those of you that have had parents that go to college, that college is extremely important to them. Well, for a long time, the poor demographic of the United States, white or black, um, a high percentage of blacks were poor for a very, very long time, right? Even leading into the civil rights movement, and still today. And so that access to education hasn't necessarily been there for um, African Americans, which again, some of it's getting better, far from perfect, right? But some of it is getting better in terms of access to those things. But either way, those are the stats. Hispanics, kind of a little bit different. They're moving here very often, right? And so they move here for better opportunities. Whether or not they had a good paying job from where they come from is I mean, I don't know, but they're probably more willing to take lower paying jobs because they are obviously moving here for better opportunities, right? And then if you look at the Asians one, it's kind of interesting if you think about it. Like the the success of your parents is going to play a role, right? And we just looked at that stat, and it's going to be one of the determining factors on the likelihood of your success. Well, Asians, the ones that have moved here, are already successful. Think about how much money it would cost to move across the Pacific Ocean to the United States, right? Those parents have already been successful, probably educated as well, and they're gonna lean on their kids to get them to go to college, and so that success is going to be passed down to their kids. Okay, just like I was saying about these statistics here about going to college. Okay, all right. So here's your graduates of different levels of education, right? So here's your high school, all right, and you've got this is everybody. If you look here, here's your whites. This is probably a little bit more importantly down here is your college graduate level, right? So first of all, we talked about women as well. First, so you can see women are catching up to men in terms of how often or how many graduate college, right? So from 2010, 2020 stats aren't out yet. The census is this year, right? And then you can see that African Americans, they don't graduate college nearly as often as whites. Asians graduate college way more often than everybody. Again, trying to help somewhat explain those wage statistics. And then over here we have the Hispanic group that graduate college the least amount for whatever reason. Okay, so again, there's a million different ways we can try to explain this stuff. And I don't have necessarily every answer of stuff, but education is obviously one of those big things. Okay, not the be all end all, but it definitely is one of those things. All right, real quick, write down something you've heard about labor unions, and we're going to quickly go through the last determining factor of what or how much you might earn. All right. So labor unions, these are basically a group of people that get together and say, hey, listen, the boss might be trying to take advantage of us. We need to kind of stick together and make sure that, we don't get taken advantage of. And they work to get better working conditions and better wages for their, they're the members of the labor union. Okay, so there's all sorts of different types of labor unions. There's a Teamsters labor union, that's like truck drivers. There's a teachers labor union. There's an electricians labor union. So they're specific to what the job is that they represent. So anyway, they started back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, and they were in response to some of those problems we've mentioned throughout the progressive era, where child labor and a 7-day work week, where people were working 12 hours a day, and they kind of got together and to stop getting taken advantage of, to try to earn some of these things. In fact, Labor Day represents labor unions. Okay, Labor Day is for workers. Okay, so that's why that day is celebrated. I know we don't usually think of it that way, but it is in recognition of that. Okay, and so how do labor unions get what they want? Well, they can go on strike, refuse to work. Okay, if you are familiar with the early 1900s, you've heard of violent strikes where workers refuse to work. People come try to take their jobs, and then a fight ensues and violence and riots and things like that. So again, if they can take away the revenue from a company, then they have some power. Okay, so if I refuse to work and let other workers even try to come in there and work, that is how labor unions can have some power. Today, labor unions are much more known for what is referred to as collective bargaining. So basically that means um, the one person is going to negotiate the contract for the entire company. Okay, so for example, like the teachers at Concord anyway, everybody has the same contract based on how many years you've taught. Okay, so one person argues and negotiates the contract for basically everybody. There's a process to it. I'll go through it quick. So the first thing is just negotiations, is referred to as a negotiation. I want this, you want that. Let's see if we can make an agreement. The next step is to hire like a lawyer, so to speak. So like mediation, and we're going to have like lawyers represent us in this particular case. Maybe they're called mediators, but similar to like if a couple was going to get a divorce, the first step is we're going to negotiate. Hey, I want this, you get that. We can't come to an agreement. Now we're going to hire a lawyer. We're going to mediate this thing out. If we can't come to an agreement, we might have to hire an arbitrator. In a divorce case, that would be divorce court, right? So we could hire an arbitrator if the case were to get to the point where no one can come to an agreement, and especially in the case of like teachers, if teachers don't go to work, that's a big problem for a community, right? So parents have to stay home with their kids, and so sometimes that arbitrator is kind of forced upon by the government. Okay, and again, that's kind of why the government's not going to let the teachers go on strike for a long period of time because it looks so bad, and the childcare situation. I mean, obviously with the COVID that we're going through, that's a big problem. For those of you that have younger siblings, you know that when they're staying at home and trying to learn from home, somebody has to be there with them, right? So they have reasons to not let teachers just go on strike and or get taken advantage of, for that matter, in terms of on the other side, the administrative side. We mentioned what a strike is. Just go ahead and plug that into your notes. Usually, they're trying to get some sort of publicity, and whether or not they get you to boycott their company stuff or whatever. That's one technique that workers use. Okay, lockouts and injunctions. Lockouts are when the bosses don't let people work. Okay, so like NFL and professional sports, um, this has been halfway common the last 10 years or so. It's probably happened a handful of times where the bosses say, "Hey, listen, you make $3 million to play football. Go ahead and think that you're going to negotiate a higher contract and a better like there's an NFL players union, and you're going to try to get better benefits. Go ahead and try to make $3 million somewhere else." And the idea is that you can't make that kind of money anywhere. So you're going to take what we give you. So if you don't want to take that, then we're going to lock you out and we're not going to pay you. Okay. So that would be why companies would lock their workers out. Bosses would lock their workers out. And then an injunction is simply when the government says you have to go to work, or you're going to go to jail. So kind of started with like a coal miner strike. So coal miners went on strike like in like the 1950s, and they were doing it in the month of October and November. Well, people heated their homes with the coal, and so the government said, "Hey, you will go back to work, or you're going to go to jail. We'll figure this out while you're working." Okay, so that's an injunction. Overall, union membership has gone down. Jobs have gotten super, super specific, right? And so people don't view it as necessary to join a union. Again, most of the jobs, I mean, there's no grocery store workers union, right? Lots of factories don't have, especially in Elkhart, don't have unions. Like there's no RV workers union that I know of. So anyway, they've declined. They're not as popular as they used to be, but they are still around. Okay, so finish things up here. What you have to do for today, you've got two assignments. Um, you've got a career research assignment, kind of going along with just our talk from day 23, and figuring out what you want to do. It won't take you too long once you get this opened up. Okay, which all right. Once you get this opened up, you'll see this. There's a link right here. Go to it, and it's going to be super simple. Okay. And so what you'll do is you'll go here. You're going to search, some type of job. Okay. And again, I'll just click on something random. So I'm going to click on an S, whatever. And let's see, severe emotional disorders for high school teachers. Okay, perfect. Let's see what that says. Okay, so, and you're going to look up some pieces of information, and you're going to fill that out. So here's what you got to do: average salary, typical entry level education, job outlook, growing or shrinking, and then why you chose to look it up. Again, it could be something you're thinking about. It could be something your parents do. It could be something, I don't know, however you want to describe why you did it. You've got to do four of them. Okay. Then at the bottom, you got to say what are two things that surprised you or two things that were interesting to you. Okay. So again, here's your salary per year. Okay. Here's your entry level education, and then here's your outlook. So it's grown. This one in particular is growing about at 3%. shouldn't take you too long to get through what you need to get through. All right. After you do that, you've also got to do this labor unions reading, okay? And so you'll open that up. It's what it looks like. You're gonna read positives and negatives. You'll go on the back side. There's some questions on there. Get those answers. It's 10 easy points. Okay, so I don't mean to give you two assignments on the same day. I should have spread them out a little bit further, but I won't have a big long assignment for day 25. Okay, so we'll talk about day 25 and all that stuff obviously then. The one thing I will mention is if your parents are curious about parent-teacher conference information, I'll be available by email from 6:30 to 8:15. Okay, so anyway, let them know if that's applicable for them, and they can email me anytime. But from 6:30 to 8:15, I will be by my computer, waiting to respond if I need to. Okay, have a good day. We will talk to you again soon.